In 72 years and 3 months on this earth, I have sat through a remarkable number of Thanksgiving dinners. I have survived turkeys so dry they could double as building material. I have endured my brother Harold showing up one year with a woman who, it turned out, was very much still somebody else's wife. I have weathered political arguments that ended friendships. A fistfight in 4th December 1993 over a football game that nobody even remembers, and the particular suffocating silence that descends over a table when someone says something that cannot be unsaid. I believed, going into that November, that there was nothing left to surprise me at a holiday meal. I was wrong about that. Before I get to what happened at that table, I need you to understand something about my daughter-in-law, Sandra, because Sandra is not a simple character in this story. She isn't the villain, even though she's going to say something in about 5 minutes of telling that will make you want to put her in that category. By the time we reach the end, you're going to feel something about her that you don't currently expect to feel. I promise you that, but we have to get there first. Sandra had brought a sweet potato casserole. She'd set it at the center of the table the way you display something you consider the centerpiece of an exhibition. I want to be fair. I genuinely do. But those sweet potatoes were a puzzle, somehow both undercooked and falling apart at the same time, and the marshmallows on top had gone well past golden into a shade of brown that suggested a small fire had been involved at some point. "Sandra, this smells incredible," my son Thomas said to her, with the conviction of a man who has been telling comfortable untruths about food for the entirety of his marriage. Thomas has always done this. It is between him and his conscience. I kept my own counsel, took a modest serving, moved it around my plate, and smiled the way a man smiles when he's 72, and has learned that certain conversations simply aren't worth the energy required to have them. My other son, Philip, was there with his wife, Donna, a practical, sensible woman originally from Indiana who brings store-bought dinner rolls without a trace of embarrassment, and whom I have always genuinely liked. Their children, my grandchildren, 9-year-old Caleb and 7-year-old Josie, were stationed at the small table in the corner, blissfully removed from the adult world and whatever it was about to produce. Lucky kids. My sister Vivian was also there. Vivian is 76, sharp as a tack, and has never in her life managed to keep a thought contained inside her head for more than about 4 seconds before it finds its way out into open air. She was on her second glass of white wine before anyone had finished the first course, which, in hindsight, I should have read as a sign of things to come. And then there was Sandra. Sandra had been married to Thomas for 7 years. Sandra had opinions on virtually every subject and expertise in almost none of them. She once told me, perfectly seriously, at a Christmas gathering, that she didn't trust people who listened to classical music. Classical music. I have listened to classical music my entire adult life. My late wife Ellen introduced me to it. Sandra and I had operated, from that moment forward, in a state of polite mutual tolerance that we both understood required some maintenance. The table talk went the usual route, football, whether Philip's brother-in-law had made a mistake buying that property up north. Vivian launched into a story about her neighbor's cat that had no discernible destination and consumed nearly 12 minutes. Philip laughed too enthusiastically at everything, the way he does when there's tension at home he's trying not to carry into the room with him. I noticed. I said nothing. That wasn't my territory. Thomas barely spoke. He kept his eyes on his plate for most of the meal. In hindsight, that was the first signal. But here's what I've come to understand about signals. You only recognize them for what they are after the fact. In the moment, a quiet man eating his turkey just looks like a quiet man eating his turkey. Thomas is my oldest son, 45 years old, broad through the shoulders, built like I was in my 40s when I still took care of myself. He has my eyes and, unfortunately, also my tendency towards stubbornness, which means the two of us have spent the better part of a decade having the same fundamental argument in slightly different clothing. He loves me. I have never doubted that for a single day. But love and ease are not the same thing, and Thomas and I had long since arrived at a version of our relationship that functioned best when there was a certain amount of geography between us. He lived 38 miles away. We had arrived at that number independently and never discussed it. Sandra, by contrast, filled every available silence. She kept steering the table toward their life, their neighborhood, renovations they were doing on the house, a trip they were considering. Always their story. Always told with a certain energy, like she was working to convince everyone of something, or maybe working to convince herself. I understand now why she was performing so hard that afternoon. That comes later. I drank my wine. I ate my turkey. I let Vivian have her 12 minutes about the neighbor's cat, and then it happened. Somewhere between the second trip to the side dishes and Vivian gearing up for what appeared to be yet another story that had no obvious conclusion, Sandra looked directly at me from across the table. I knew that look. I had seen it before. It was the look she got when she'd been holding something behind her teeth for a while, and the wine had finally given her permission to release it. I should have excused myself to use the restroom. I did not excuse myself. "You know, Harold," Sandra said, loudly enough for the whole table to hear, setting her fork down with a small, pointed little sound, "I've been sitting here thinking." Lord have mercy, I thought. I kept my face pleasant. "Is that right?" "I think," she said, pausing to glance around the table as though building to a punchline, "that you are genuinely the person in this family that people complain about the most." She laughed, waited for someone to join her. Nobody did. She pushed on anyway. She looked me directly in the eye and said, "Does it ever bother you, being the one everyone can't quite stand?" What happened to the sound in that room is something I won't forget as long as I live. It was the kind of silence where you become aware of details you normally tune out. The candles guttering slightly in the draft from the heating vent, the faint sound of the children murmuring at their little table, Vivian's wine glass stopping midway through its journey to her mouth and staying there, suspended. As if even Vivian's reflexes had stopped to process what had just been said. Philip made a sound like a man who had accidentally swallowed something wrong. Donna fixed her eyes on her plate with the concentrated attention of a woman who was mentally preparing for the drive home to Indiana. And Thomas, my son Thomas, said nothing. He looked at his food, he picked up his fork, he set it back down, he did not look at me. I want you to sit with that detail because that is the detail that has stayed with me every single day since. Not Sandra's words, Thomas's silence. There is a particular quality to the hurt that only your children can inflict, and it is never delivered through what they do. It is delivered through what they choose not to do in the moment when doing something would have mattered. Thomas chose stillness. He chose his plate. I held that for a count of about 4 seconds. Then I reached over and set my wine glass down on the table. Not hard, not as a statement. I just set it down the way you set something down when you want both your hands still and your mind entirely clear. I looked at Sandra. She was still smiling, but it had changed. Smaller. Something uncertain had crept into it, like she'd expected a specific reaction and wasn't sure what to do with the one she was actually getting. "Sandra," I said, my voice even almost quiet, "let me ask you something." "Okay," she said, more careful now. "How do you imagine it would feel?" I said slowly, holding her gaze across the table. "If you found out today, not tomorrow, not sometime next week, but today, that you had no home to go back to?" Nobody at that table breathed. "What?" Sandra said. "If you drove back tonight," I continued in the same unhurried voice, "and discovered that the house where you live, the address on your license, the roof you've been sleeping under, all of it was simply gone. How would that feel?" "Harold, what are you even talking about?" "You asked me a question," I said simply. "I'm returning the courtesy." The laugh was entirely gone now. She looked at Thomas. And here is where I need you to pay close attention, because Thomas's expression in that moment was not confusion. It was something else entirely. It was the look of a man who has been holding a door closed with everything he has and can feel it beginning to move on its own. He was terrified. "Dad," his voice came out low and tight, part warning, part something else I didn't have a name for yet. "Just making conversation," I said pleasantly, and picked my wine glass back up. Vivian, for the first time in my memory, put her Chardonnay down entirely. If you want to understand how serious the room had become, that single detail should settle it for you. Philip cleared his throat so loudly it was almost theatrical. "Anyone want more rolls? Donna, the rolls are." "They're from the grocery store," Donna said automatically, and then seemed to register that this was perhaps not the most pressing matter in the room at that particular moment. Sandra was still looking at me. The performance was gone. What had replaced it was something I had not expected to see, not embarrassment, not wounded vanity. Something that lived deeper than either of those. Real fear. And that told me something I filed away carefully. She already knew something was wrong. She didn't know the shape of it yet, didn't know the full dimensions. But underneath all of that talking and performing, and the casserole placed at the center of the table like a trophy, Sandra already knew the ground under her life wasn't as solid as she'd been led to believe. I had just given that knowing a face. Thomas picked up his fork again. His hand was not entirely steady. I finished my wine. Outside, the November wind pushed against the windows. The candles on the table moved together, just once, like something trying to get our attention. I should tell you what I knew. I should tell you what I had been carrying by myself for 8 months. What had begun on a cold afternoon in March when Thomas came and sat across from me at my kitchen table, eyes red, shoulders down, and told me everything. But before any of that makes sense, you need to understand what it costs to carry it. Let me tell you something nobody warns you about when you agree to keep a secret for 8 months on behalf of someone you love. It doesn't stay the same weight. It grows. Every day adds to it quietly, without asking permission. By the morning after that Thanksgiving, I was carrying enough that I'm genuinely surprised the kitchen chair held me. I have been an early riser my entire adult life. 6 in the morning without fail, without an alarm. My late wife Ellen used to tell me I got up before dawn because I was convinced the day would start without me if I didn't. She wasn't entirely wrong about that. I like to be ahead of things. I like to see what's coming. Which is exactly why what Thomas had done to himself, and to his family, and in some ways to me, had kept me looking at the ceiling for 8 months straight. You cannot see something coming when the person hiding it is someone you raised. The morning after Thanksgiving, I was sitting at my kitchen table at just past 6 with my coffee when my phone rang. It was Philip. "Dad, you want to tell me what that was all about last night?" No greeting. Philip has never seen the value in easing into a conversation. "Good morning to you too, son," I said. "Dad." I took a slow drink of coffee. "It was dinner talk, Philip. People have conversations at dinner." "People have conversations at dinner," he repeated back at me, in the tone of someone deciding whether they're being played with. "Dad, you essentially told your daughter-in-law she might be out on the street, at Thanksgiving, in front of the kids." "Caleb and Josie were at the other table," I said. "That is not the point." "I asked a hypothetical question," I said. "She asked me one first. I simply answered in kind." A long pause followed. I could hear Donna's voice in the background, low and indistinct. Philip covered the phone and said something to her. When he came back, his voice had changed, more deliberate, more careful. "Dad," he said, "is something going on with Thomas?" I set my coffee cup down. 8 months. 8 months of watching my oldest son paper over a collapsing wall and assure everyone the dampness was nothing. 8 months of watching Sandra renovate a house she didn't know was held together partly by my name on wire transfers. 8 months of watching a clock that only I could see. "You ought to ask Thomas that," I said. "I'm asking you." Philip, I kept my voice level and steady. There are things that aren't mine to tell. What I will tell you is this: pay attention over the next few days. That's all I'm going to say on the matter. He didn't like that. Philip never likes partial information, but he knows me well enough to understand when a door is closed. We got off the phone at 6:30. By 20 minutes to 7, Thomas was calling. I let it ring twice before I answered. Not to be theatrical about it, I simply needed a moment to decide what kind of father I was going to be when I picked up. The one who softens things or the one who tells the truth. I picked up. "Dad," his voice came through rough and worn. He hadn't slept. Good, I thought. Neither had I. "Thomas," I said back. "What were you doing last night?" Direct, no warm-up. "Having Thanksgiving dinner with my family," I said. "The turkey was very good. The sweet potato casserole was not, but we don't need to go into that. This isn't something to be funny about." "No," I agreed, and my voice went quiet. "It really isn't." The silence that followed stretched long enough that I could hear his breathing, that slow, deliberate exhale he's had since he was a teenager, the one that means he's working to hold himself in one piece. I used to hear that sound through his bedroom door after his mother died. It is not a sound a father forgets. "She's asking questions," Thomas finally said. "I imagine she is." "Dad, I need you to just—" "No," I said it once gently, but in the way that means completely. "Thomas, I have done everything you asked me to do for 8 months. I have stayed quiet. I have watched you fill buckets on a sinking ship and tell your wife the floor is just a little damp. I am done with that silence." I paused. "The mortgage payment came back in March," I said. "I covered it. I covered April and May and every month since then because you asked me to, and I love you, and I was foolish enough to believe you were about to get yourself sorted." I let that land. "How much does she know?" I asked. "Nothing." "Thomas, how much does Sandra know?" He was quiet for a moment. "She knows we've been tight," he said, searching for a word that wouldn't sound as bad as the truth. I almost laughed. "Son, tight and underwater are not the same situation. One is a minor inconvenience. The other one takes you with it if you don't do something." "I have a plan," he started. "You've had a plan since March," I said back to him. The silence after that was the longest of our whole conversation, and I want you to understand something about that particular quiet between a father and his son on an early Friday morning. It was not empty. It was the sound of something shifting. 8 months of me holding a position I should never have taken, and both of us finally feeling the ground move. "Ryan," I said, softer this time. "He has gone by that nickname since he was small, though I won't explain it. It just came out in that moment. I am not doing this to punish you. I need you to hear that and believe it. But I cannot go on covering a life you haven't been honest about. Not with Sandra, not with your brother, not with yourself." I stopped. This month is the last one. After this, I step back. I heard something on his end that I don't think he meant to let through. My son is 45 years old and stubborn in a way that reminds me of looking in an old mirror. And I cannot tell you adequately what it does to a father to hear that particular sound come through a phone at 6 in the morning. "Okay," Thomas said finally. The word came out barely formed, like air finding a small opening. "Okay," I said back. We sat on the line together for another minute, neither of us saying anything at all. Sometimes that's exactly what's needed. Sometimes two people just have to breathe together in the same silence for a little while before anything can move forward. He told Sandra on Sunday. Philip called me that evening to tell me Thomas had reached out to him first, looking for backup, looking for someone to help soften it. And Philip, God bless that boy, had said no. Kindly, but no. Whether I had planted that in him or whether he simply knew on his own, I couldn't say. Either way, I was proud of him. Donna apparently handed Philip a glass of bourbon the moment he hung up and said, "I love this family, but it is a lot." Philip told me she wants that on her headstone someday. Thomas sat Sandra down that Sunday afternoon and told her everything. The missed payments, a failed investment he'd been too ashamed to mention, my name on every transfer that had been standing between them and real trouble for the better part of a year. I know this because Sandra called me herself at 9 that evening. She didn't raise her voice. I had steeled myself for raised voices. Instead, she was very quiet, and every bit of the performance that had accumulated over 7 years of Thanksgiving dinners and Christmas gatherings was simply absent. She sounded like a person rather than a presentation, and it struck me that this was probably the most honest conversation she and I had ever had. "How long?" she asked me. 8 months, I said. A pause. "Why didn't you come to me?" "Because he's my son," I said, as honestly as I knew how. "And I believed he was going to fix it himself. That was my error, and I'm sorry for it." She didn't answer that right away. I heard her breathing, processing, rearranging what she thought she understood about the past year of her own life. "Are we going to lose the house?" she asked, just that, clear and direct without anything decorative around it. In that moment, she had my complete respect. "Not if we move quickly and sensibly," I said. "Okay," she said. Same word Thomas had used, same stripped-down, exhausted syllable. And in that moment, for the first time in 8 months, I felt the weight begin to redistribute. Not disappear, nothing that complicated disappears in a phone call, but shift, which told me something real had finally begun. The Monday after Thanksgiving, I drove the 38 miles to Thomas and Sandra's house. I didn't call first. I have found in 72 years that certain conversations need to happen in person before anyone has had time to get their guard back up. Thomas would have rehearsed. Sandra would have rehearsed. I needed them before the rehearsals. I pulled into their driveway just after 10 in the morning and sat in the truck for a moment before getting out. It was a good house, red brick, white trim, a wooden porch swing on the front that had needed new chains for a year and a half. Ellen would have liked it. I thought about that for a moment. Then I got out of the truck. Sandra opened the front door before I reached it. She had been awake for hours, clearly, no pretense about her appearance, hair pulled simply back, wearing one of Thomas's old flannels. She looked younger than I had ever seen her, more like an actual person than the version of herself she usually brought to family gatherings. "Harold," she said, "not warm, not cold, just real." "Sandra," I said back, "may I come in?" She stepped aside without a word. Thomas was at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee he hadn't touched. He looked up when I came through the doorway. And I watched his face cycle through 4 or 5 things in under 2 seconds: surprise, then something that might have been relief, then guilt, and then just plain tiredness settling over all of it. "I didn't know you were coming," he said. "I know," I said, pulling out the chair across from him and sitting down as if this were a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. That was intentional. Sandra stood near the counter, not quite sitting, leaning against it slightly like she needed something solid behind her. "So," she said, looking between us, "what happens from here?" I noticed that she didn't ask Thomas alone. She looked at both of us, because in the span of one Sunday afternoon, the whole structure of her marriage had been rebuilt from different materials, and she was still finding out where everyone stood in the new arrangement. I reached into my inside jacket pocket and placed a folded piece of paper on the table. Thomas looked at it. "What is that?" "It's a number," I said. "The exact sum of what I've put in over these 8 months. The mortgage payments, the insurance that lapsed in the summer, the property taxes in the fall that you didn't mention but that I found out about regardless." Thomas closed his eyes briefly. "I am not here to collect it," I said clearly, before either of them could speak. "I want that understood completely. That money is gone and I've made my peace with it. But I needed both of you to see what the number actually is, because you cannot begin to address something you haven't allowed yourself to look at directly." Sandra unfolded the paper. I watched her face as she read it. There's a particular quality of stillness that comes over a person when they're doing arithmetic in their head and finding that none of the answers are acceptable. That's what I saw. "Thomas," Sandra said quietly, setting the paper on the table. "I know," he said. He wasn't looking at either of us. He was looking at the table in front of him. "Look at me," she said to him. He did, slowly. The way a person looks at someone when there's nothing left between them to hide behind. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. Not accusatory. Something underneath accusation, something that hurts more than anger does. "Why did you let your father carry this instead of just telling me the truth?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. And then he said something that I was not prepared for, something that I think surprised even him as it came out. "Because you married someone who had everything figured out," he said to her, "and I didn't know how to tell you that man was gone." The kitchen went completely quiet. I have been present for a great many things in my life. I held Ellen's hand through the last night she had. I have been in rooms where things were broken beyond repair and rooms where the repair happened anyway. I have heard sentences that took something from me and sentences that gave something back. That sentence from my son, in that quiet kitchen on a gray Monday morning, opened something in that room that no argument had ever been able to reach. Sandra looked at Thomas for a long time. I watched her face, and what I saw there was something I had genuinely not expected after 7 years of Thanksgiving dinners and maintained distances. She walked around the table, pulled out the chair directly beside him, not across from him, beside him, and sat down. That small movement told me more about who Sandra actually was than everything that had come before it. "You are still that man," she said to him with a firmness that had nothing brittle in it. "You are also this one, and this one needed to stop being alone with it." Thomas looked at her. Something happened in his face. The way a sky changes after a long rain has finally stopped, and the light begins to find its way back through. He reached over and took her hand. I looked away. Some moments belong only to the people in them. I drove the 38 miles home under a November sky that had turned clean and pale, the late autumn light thin and gold in the way it gets when the season is running low and seems to be making the most of what remains. I thought about Ellen the whole way. I thought about how she would have handled this differently, with more warmth, more speed, more of that instinct she had for knowing when to say something, and when simply being present was enough. I thought about how I had stumbled through it in my own clumsy way, and somehow come out the other side of it. I thought about that Thanksgiving table, Sandra's words, my wine glass going down, Thomas looking at his plate instead of at me, and I thought about something I have come to believe more firmly as I've gotten older. A parent's job is not to protect their children from every hard thing that finds them. It's to stay close enough that when the hard thing arrives, they don't have to face it by themselves. I pulled into my driveway, went inside, and put on some music. Ellen was the one who first got me listening to it properly, decades ago. Sandra once told me she didn't trust people who appreciated classical music. I've decided to forgive her for that. Sitting in my house that evening with the music moving through the rooms, I wasn't bracing for anything. I wasn't watching for what might be coming. For the first time in 8 months, I had put the weight down. And I cannot adequately tell you what a relief it was to simply sit. If this story reached you in some way, we'd be grateful if you take a moment to like it and follow along with us. At Dad's Pure Emotions, these are the stories we tell, honest ones, about family, about love, and about all the things it quietly costs. Thank you for being here.